Now, this case is absolutely a head scratcher, and it's actually gained quite a big cult following and has earned the title as Finland's most infamous unsolved murder mystery. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, we're going to discuss the Lake Bodom Murders. Now, before we get into it, let me just introduce myself. Hi, my name is Ashley, and I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. So if that's your thing, stick around and let's get into the story. Now, this story actually takes us back to the 1960s, specifically on June 5th. It was an early morning on Lake Bodom, which is actually located northwest of Helsinki, approximately a 30-minute drive. A local carpenter named Esko Johansson was in the area when he happened to come across a very gruesome scene. Instead of catching fish or bird watching, Esko discovered the brutally beaten bodies of 4 teenagers. Since then, there have been many theories and just as many suspects that we'll cover in this video, but since that fateful day, the mystery of who potentially killed these kids has remained unsolved. Now, the victims in question are the following, and I apologize in advance for my pronunciation of these words. I am having a really hard time with them. So again, I will do my best, but I do apologize. So the first one we have is 15-year-old Mela Bjorklund, 15-year-old Anya Maki, and these 2 girls were friends, and they were also on this trip with both of their boyfriends, 18-year-old Seppo Boaman and 18-year-old Niels Gustafsson. Now, I know what you're all thinking right away. I know the age difference is a little shocking. This would not work in today's society, in today's culture, but back then, things were quite different. The 4 friends had decided to go camping at Lake Bodom. It's a very popular area not too far from Helsinki, and it's also neighboring a town called Espoo. It's a beautiful, idyllic place favored by locals where people can go fishing, camping, hiking, feed reindeers, just all around an outdoor person's version of heaven. Like I mentioned earlier, this was supposed to be a really fun trip amongst friends. The 2 girls were close friends and they decided to bring their boyfriends, so it was just supposed to be a really fun weekend. They arrived to the campsite and everything is going as expected. They did some activities, enjoyed the outdoors, and before they knew it, it was time to call it a night. On June 4th, 1960, the teenagers all went to bed sometime between 10:30 and 11 p.m., not knowing that for 3 of them, it would be their last day on Earth. It's estimated that sometime between 4 and 6 a.m. on the morning of June 5th, 1960, Mila, Anya, and Seppo were all brutally stabbed to death, and whoever did this went straight through their tent, slashing at everything in their way. Niels was also brutally attacked. He was a victim in all of this, but somehow he ended up surviving. Now, although Niels did survive, he did endure some major damage. I'm very surprised he was able to heal and didn't actually pass away from all of these injuries. But from what we know is that he did have a concussion, he had a broken jaw, he had broken facial bones, and it was even said that he had brain fluid seeping through his nose. The next morning, their collapsed tents were actually spotted by a group of young boys nearby who were there bird watching. They also recalled seeing a blonde man walking away from the tent, but out of fear, they didn't report this to police right away. A few hours later, around 11 a.m., a man named Esko Johansson, who also happened to be a carpenter, came across the horrifying crime scene. Immediately, he turns around and obviously heads straight to the police to notify them about what he had just discovered. And it ended up taking police approximately an entire hour to get to the crime scene. So when police arrived, it was very obvious to them that whoever did this had a lot of rage in them, but there was also a few things that caught them off guard about the entire situation. The tents had been slashed open, meaning that whoever did this didn't bother going in through the front entrance. They didn't bother unzipping the tent. They kind of just started stabbing and slashing at everything completely blind, hoping that whatever direction they were going with would end up landing them a direct hit. It was also very apparent to police that Mila had suffered the worst injuries because she had actually been stabbed 15 times, many of which were also done after she had passed away. So it was very clear that someone had some sort of vendetta against her or was super angry. As they took a closer look to all of these victims' injuries, they noticed that they weren't just stabbed. All of the victims, except for Neil's, had their heads bashed in with some sort of blunt and very heavy object. As police looked around the rest of the scene, they started seeing that a lot of the personal belongings, including some money that belonged to the 4 teenagers, had indeed been stolen. But they did come across something very odd. The kids had all arrived to Lake Bodom on their motorbikes, and the attacker had stolen the keys to the motorbikes, but just left them there, almost as if he had to leave in a hurry or didn't want to make noise and cause attention towards what had just happened. And throughout the entire investigation, police unfortunately were not able to find either of the murder weapons. So because Niels was the only surviving member of the entire ordeal, police only had his testimony to rely on. After he had regained consciousness, they went to the hospital, started asking him a bunch of questions, but unfortunately, because he had suffered a lot of head injuries, he could not remember very much, which, is completely understandable. You've just been attacked. You're probably going through a lot of trauma. He did have a concussion, so it only makes sense that he was not able to remember a lot of the details. However, he did give police a small piece of information. He said that he was the one that was attacked first, and because it all happened so quickly, all he could really remember was that this man, whoever he was wearing all black, and that he also happened to have red eyes. Now, I'm not sure if this was because he was just seeing things or if because this person was maybe under the influence of some sort of substance that causes him to have red eyes, or maybe he was extremely sleep deprived, maybe he had pink eye. But that was what Niels ended up telling the police. Eventually, Niels would go under multiple hypnotherapy sessions in order to see if he could remember any more information. And they were lucky with this. He was able to remember additional details about what this perpetrator looked like, and from this, they were able to develop a sketch. But this is where it gets incredibly frustrating. Instead of treating this like an active crime scene, police did not bother treating it as such. They didn't tape it off, and they kind of just let it be. Eventually, this crime scene became so contaminated that it was almost guaranteed that many important pieces of information and evidence had gotten lost. After they had removed the bodies from the scene, police, like I said, they didn't tape it off. So by that time, word had spread across the town surrounding Lake Bodom that there had been a gruesome murder on the lake. So there were, of course, a lot of spectators, a lot of curious people that had come to see what was going on. After police had left the scene, people were basically allowed to walk through, look for themselves, which heavily contaminated the area and probably did cause the police and investigation to lose potential DNA evidence. News reporters also heard about what was going on, and it quickly became headlines across Finland about how much of a shoddy job the police department had done. And of course, nobody wants any bad press, so in order to save themselves, the police got the help of the Finnish military in order to help them retrieve as much evidence as possible from the crime scene. Unfortunately, though, by that point, it was way too late and nothing new was able to be found. Okay, so the suspects. Who were the leading people here? Well, immediately, like in all crime cases, theories started swirling around about who could have possibly done this to 4 innocent teenagers. Initially, police had, a decent idea, and they started looking at criminals in the area. Someone that takes on 4 individuals by themselves could potentially be some sort of serial killer. So they started looking at potential people like that in the area. And that's when they came across a man called Pentti Soinoinen. He was a violent criminal with a long list of infractions. In the 1960s, he was overheard talking to an inmate while he was in prison for unrelated crimes about the Lake Bodom murders, saying that he was responsible for them and even bragging about it. There was one problem though. At the time of the murders, Penty would have only been 14 years old, leaving many people to question whether this entire thing would have even been possible for someone so young, considering he was 14, taking on two 15-year-olds, two 18-year-old boys. It hardly makes any sense. Unfortunately, though, in 1969, Penty chose to take his own life in prison without police ever knowing the full truth. So with their first suspect out of the question at this point, they had to start looking elsewhere, and that's when they came across suspect number 2. Now, this man was named Carl Gillstrom, but he went by a much more popular name in town known as Kiosk Man. He was known to residents as Kiosk Man because he happened to have a kiosk nearby. Although he was a familiar face to everyone, he definitely was not the friendliest one, let me tell you. Since Lake Bodom was popular for tourists, there would be quite a lot of them around. People would come here on the weekends, but Carl was said to have completely despised these people, especially children. Although I'm not entirely sure why he had so much hatred for these people because having a kiosk, I'm assuming that a lot of the people that would buy from him would be these tourists. Kiosks are known for selling stuff like newspapers or some bare essentials, maybe even snacks. So it's not hard to believe that tourists in the area would stop by his kiosk and grab a few necessities. But anyways, he was known for being quite angry and bitter towards these people. Some locals even claim to have seen Kiosk Man throw rocks at hikers and even cut and slash down some of their tents in retaliation. But that's not all police had to go on. It's also reported that Carl was seen by multiple witnesses at the crime scene in the early morning hours leaving the area. But because so many people had this fear of him, he had such a bad reputation in town, it wasn't reported to police right away. It was also reported that Carl was seen pouring cement into a well that was in his backyard after the murders, which led people to believe that this was him concealing the murdered weapons. But it gets much worse. Police started looking into Carl, they started following all of these leads. His reputation wasn't really helping him. So they go to Carl and they start questioning him. And surprisingly, Carl ends up confessing to the murders not once, but multiple times while he was both sober and quite drunk. Police initially looked into his whereabouts that evening, and the only person that was able to corroborate his alibi was his wife. She went on to tell police that Carl had been home that entire night, that he was asleep in their bed on the night of the murders, which, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how much we can trust this. Partners are known to cover for their partners, especially when they're in trouble and they have a lot to lose. So I'm not entirely sure how credible this alibi is. Paired with the fact that Carl was also known to be a belligerent drunk, police eventually ended up dismissing him and his confessions altogether. Sadly, just 9 years later, in 1972, Carl met the same fate as Penty. Carl chose to end his own life by jumping into Lake Bodom. But before doing this, he had left a note behind. Inside, it read that he had been the one responsible for taking the lives of the 3 teenagers, and we would later find out that before Carl took his own life, he had actually gone to a friend to talk to him about something very disturbing. He goes to his friend and asks him what he should do if he had been the one responsible for these murders, to which his friend replies it was better for him to basically take his own life than to spend the rest of his life in prison, and he had even made the suggestion of taking his own life at Lake Bodom. And it's reported that later that day, he actually did take that advice, and that's where he chose to end his life. In the end, whether or not Kiosk Man was responsible for these heinous crimes, police were never able to fully determine whether he had been telling the truth or not. So that brings us to suspect number 3, and his name was Hans Assman. And I know what you're thinking, this is his real name, but let's just try to move on from that. and he actually remained police's main suspect for decades up until 2004. A doctor named Jorma Palo came forward saying that they had treated Hans shortly after the murders had occurred. Back then, it was widely believed that Hans was a former KGB spy living on the shores surrounding Lake Bodom. All people really knew about him was that he was super closed off, he was introverted, he was known to be a loner, and theories surrounding him being a KGB spy led many to think that he had already committed multiple murders in the past. And coincidentally, Hans also happened to have blonde hair, matching the man that was seen leaving the crime scene that morning. However, I'm not entirely sure about how credible this is because, you're in Northern Europe. Almost everyone has blonde hair, so it's not like it's out of the ordinary for people to have these characteristics. So to me, this is a pretty weak point of evidence. What really seemed to convince people about his involvement in the case was that following the day after the murders, Hans had checked into the Helsinki hospital with many signs of an altercation, which is what this doctor ended up reporting on. He was in a very delirious state. He was acting extremely odd. He also happened to have black dirt under his fingernails, and his clothes, believe it or not, were drenched in human blood. Again, because of how botched this entire investigation was, his clothing, I don't even know why they wouldn't do this, but his clothing was not tested for blood, despite the doctors at the hospitals insisting that it was human blood and that it should have been tested or at least held for evidence. In the end, though, the blood was assumed to have been his own, which is why I guess police didn't bother testing it. After Hans had heard about the description of the killer and having seen the sketch of what this person could potentially have looked like, I must admit though, when you look at them side by side, they do look similar, especially around the eye area with the sunken eyes. Hans went ahead and he ended up shaving his blonde hair and went completely bald, which, if you ask me, is quite suspicious. However, over time, police revealed that Hans did have a secret alibi that completely removed him as a suspect. Apparently, he was in Germany when the Lake Bodom murders happened, where he was the main suspect of a separate murder, which also went unsolved. And that is a completely other story on its own, which I could make a whole other video on. So let me know if you guys want to hear that. Then came suspect number 4, and this one was completely unexpected. It was quite a big shocker. 44 years after the Lake Bodom murders had occurred, police went and arrested the sole survivor, Niels, claiming that they had enough evidence to prove that he had been the murderer all along. The miracle that had saved Niels also proved to be his curse when police laid out what they think exactly happened at his trial in 2005. And this was all over the news. It was all over the headline. It was Finland's biggest unsolved case at the time, and it still is, so it only makes sense that it captured the attention of all the citizens of the country. Unfortunately, this entire situation was quite detrimental to Niels because by that point, he had already survived a near-fatal heart attack. He had gone on to rebuild as much of his life as possible. He had also gone on to get married and did have 2 children. And by the time this entire trial started, he had been retired, which definitely is not how you plan on spending your retirement years. So it was presented that the key piece of evidence police were using against Niels were his shoes, and that the blood DNA tested from them gave them a lot of information. Police claimed that the shoes revealed the blood of the 3 other victims, but none of Niels himself. From there, police put a story together of what they think happened that morning. Basically, they said that the group had been drinking, but that Niels had overdone it and a fight broke out between Niels and his friend over Mila, his girlfriend. It's believed that there was some sort of relationship issue or jealousy between the 2 men when it came to Mila, which is why believed she actually suffered the worst injuries as some sort of crime of passion. It was then believed that he was told to leave the camp area, but of course, not wanting their friend to be out in the cold, left alone in the middle of an isolated area, it's believed that Seppo went towards Niels in an attempt to talk and kind of work things out. It was then that police think that Niels and Seppo got into a very violent fist fight, which is how they explained Niels' facial injuries. And then in a fit of rage, Niels was believed to have returned back to camp with Seppo and then proceeded to brutally stab everyone on site. After the crime had been committed, police believed that Niels proceeded to stab himself multiple times in order to stage the scene as much as possible before trying to get rid of his shoes and clothes that were later found about half a mile away from the crime scene. Police then backed up their claims using witnesses who said that they saw a blonde man leaving the scene in the morning, claiming that it must have been Niels and that this was when he had taken his shoes and his clothes that were later found further away from the campsite. This was basically him trying to stage the crime scene, trying to make it look like it was an unknown assailant that had done this. It was also presented that Niels had apparently been overheard bragging to a woman, a friend of his, about how he had gotten away with the crime about a decade after the entire thing had happened. However, this was not able to be fully corroborated. But of course, Niels and his defense team were not going to take this lying down. He was adamant that he had absolutely nothing to do with this. He had simply, been guilty of surviving a very horrible crime. Niels and his defense team quickly broke down the police's argument, stating that if Niels and Seppo had truly gotten into a fight, there is absolutely no way that Niels could have then proceeded to kill 3 people in the violent manner that they were killed, with all of the facial injuries that he had sustained, not to mention the brain fluid that was said to have been leaking from his nose. Then after that, it meant that he would have still had the energy and the ability to walk half a mile there and back to hide the rest of the evidence. Thankfully, on October 7, 2005, Niels was cleared of all the charges and was even awarded 44,000 euros in exchange for the time he spent in prison and for his mental anguish, which is hardly enough if you ask me. It's quite frustrating when police do this, when, they kind of use someone as a scapegoat because the investigators or the officers at the time were incompetent or just did not know what they were doing. They kind of use someone as a scapegoat after that person has already been through a tremendous amount of trauma. Not only did he lose his girlfriend at the time, but he also lost 3 of his friends. So it's really frustrating and infuriating to see this happen to someone who happened to survive something that most of us will never ever experience. It's like adding insult to injury, basically. Now, the final clue in all of this that police had to go on came from one of the victims' funerals, although I'm not entirely sure which victim. I was not able to confirm which of the 3 victims this photo was taken at. But if you take a look here, this photo was taken that shows a man resembling the composite sketch. And to be honest, it really does look like a match. Again, the eyes look very similar. And if you're a fan of true crime, you will likely know that serial killers make it a habit to go to the funerals of their victims as a way to see the final product of their actions or to even subtly brag themselves, kind of like, haha, I was able to get away with this. All of these people have no idea that it was me. No one suspects a thing. It's kind of like a pat on the back for themselves. Anyways, many people believe that this person is actually Hans himself. However, sources claim that Hans had never gone to any of the funerals, and to this day, the person in the photo has never been identified. And that's where we're at with the Lake Bodom murders, a very grisly, gruesome crime that was committed very long ago, and to this day, police are nowhere near closer to finding out who did it. Personally, if you ask me, it sounds like it could have been either Kiosk Man or Hans, but Hans seems to have this solid alibi, but he does have the criminal record of someone who has been involved in other similar crimes, whereas Kiosk Man was probably a very depressed, disgruntled, sad human being that probably drank his sorrows away and unfortunately ended up taking his own life. So if he did do it, we'll never know the truth. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you've heard of any other information that I did not mention in this video. I did spend quite a lot of time researching it. There's not a ton of detail out there, because I guess it was so long ago and because of how botched the case was. But if you do know of any other information, leave it in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinion on this. But that's going to do it for me on today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. And if you want more crime creepy content, don't forget to check out my TikTok. It's linked in the description box below. And I will see you guys in the next video.